What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and a couple weeks ago, I made a video about a move in the fight phase that you can do called combat slingshotting. And oh boy, some of you did not like that video. I was accused of cheating, bending the rules, and doing all sorts of unspeakable things to the Warhammer 40k community, but I'm going to be breaking down some of the comments that y'all left on that video because I think it's a great opportunity to break down some of the common misconceptions that people have about Warhammer 40,000's combat, charging, and fight phase rules. I also think that there's some interesting philosophical discussions to be had about the Warhammer 40k rules in general. Now, first, I'm going to briefly discuss what this video is about. I'll leave a link in the video description as well, pinned on the screen here, so you can check it out and watch the full video in its entirety. But very quickly, what I talked about in that video is using your charge and or pile-in moves to physically block areas around the target of your charge. Once the area around your charge target is blocked and it's no longer possible for models to move into base contact with those models when performing a charge or a pile-in move, the only requirement for those models is that they move towards the closest enemy model. As an aside, I also think it's important to note here that in this case, the definition of towards, meaning that the move must end closer to that model than it began. There is a separate definition for directly towards or moving as close as possible. If they can't be brought into base-to-base contact, they don't have to. This essentially means that once you've filled up the real estate next to your charge target, or if you're too far away to move to base contact with them to begin with, you actually get a much freer charge move than you would normally. You're able to move in kind of combat orbit, getting closer to the charge target while potentially maneuvering yourself around the battlefield a little bit. That can potentially allow you to bring new enemies into the fight. By completing your charge move near them, they become the closest model to you, and you can then pile in and fight them, which means you could potentially fight models that you didn't necessarily charge or engage them later on during the fight phase, which is super useful for a wide variety of reasons. Clipping out enemy models by swinging your powerful combat characters into them is great, but also just engaging them or using that movement to get onto objectives is very powerful. Now, that brings up the first of our comments here, and I am going to be covering out the usernames for these because the goal isn't to call out anyone for not knowing the rules. We're just going to be answering the questions. But the first comment here states that I thought you could only enter engagement range with another unit if you declared a charge on them or you declared a multi-charge. Now, that is true of the charge move specifically. When you declare a charge, you can move into engagement range of the targets that you declared of that charge, but you're not allowed to move into engagement range of other enemies. This also allows you to potentially kind of construct situations where it's more difficult for you to move base contact with your charge target because there are other models intermixed or in the vicinity, and not declaring those as a charge target can actually make your charge a little easier. A little bit weird how that works, but it is what it is. However, when you're performing a pile-in or consolidate move, you are totally unrestricted. The only requirement is that you move towards the closest enemy unit and into base contact if possible, and so you can move into contact with new enemies. And this follows up with another comment about declaring attacks into those new targets that you've engaged. You have to declare the unit that you're slingshotting into as a charge target though, right? I didn't think you could declare attacks against a unit that you didn't choose as a charge target in a phase in which you charged. Now, that is another common misconception because that's how the rules used to work in 9th edition. In 9th edition, they had actually constricted a lot of the potential combat movement that you could do. 8th edition was a wild time when it came to combat movement. It was free and clear, and you could do almost anything you wanted. It was insane. However, 9th edition restricted a lot of that and said that if you declared a unit as a charge target, you could only attack that unit in the fight phase. That rule was removed in 10th edition. Now, if we want to talk philosophy a little bit, I do think that this is one of the problems with 40k's persistent edition updates. They add these very small clarifications, these very small rules changes in there. Sometimes I think just to justify having a new edition, and that gets people confused. That restriction does not exist in 10th edition. The only requirements in order to target a unit with your model with a melee attack is that you're within engagement range of it, or that you are in base contact with someone who is in base contact with a model in that unit. That's all you have to do. It doesn't matter if you charged. It doesn't matter if they charged. None of that makes a difference. Now, with that, there were a couple of people who had questions about piling in specifically, because the piling in and consolidate rules are a little confusing. First of all, does the attacking player have to pile in? I played and my opponent wasn't moving his guys, as it says they may move up to 3 inches. The answer is no. You are not required to pile in or consolidate when you make your combat moves. You may, if you want to, and if you don't have to move to base contact, you may move up to any distance up to that 3 inches that you have. There are many instances in which you don't want to pile in. If doing so would make your formation weird by forcing you to move base contact, you can just say, I'm not going to pile in with these models, and you can pile in with other models in your unit. It is determined on a per model basis. So if one model piling in would force it to move into contact with somebody that you don't want to get into engagement range of, you can just say, hey, I'm not going to move that guy. He's just going to stand still. You could also have a situation where one of your models is standing on an objective and piling in would move it off the objective. You're not required to pile him in at that point. It's also important to note that when you pile in, you must respect your coherency rules. So you have to have all the models in your unit chained 2 inches from each other and potentially chained 2 inches of each other as well if they are 7 or more models in the unit. And if you started a pile in or consolidate move outside of coherency and you choose to move those models, you must move them into coherency. If you don't, by the end of the fight phase, you'll go to the end of the turn at that point and you'll check coherency. And if you're not in coherency, then you'll start removing models from that unit until it's back in coherency. So that can be bad for you, but that's up to you. Now, there were a couple people confused about the requirements to pile in as well. One comment asks, doesn't it say that you can only pile in if the model that is piling in ends its move in engagement range of an enemy model? The answer is no. And this is an important point about the distinction between models and units. The requirement is that when a unit piles in, that unit must end in engagement range of an enemy. Each model only moves towards the closest enemy model base to base if possible. That requirement is essentially so that your units don't simply pile in if there are no eligible enemies around them. If you charge an enemy unit with 2 of your units and the first one absolutely obliterates it, and there are now no enemies within range to move and engage from the second unit, they will not pile in. However, if we go back to that example and the first unit has charged and they are currently engaging the enemy, the entire unit is eligible to pile in because they will automatically end that move in engagement range. If they start the pile in move in engagement, they are definitionally going to end the pile in move in engagement. If they don't, you did something wrong because you have to move towards the closest model. And if you're already engaging them, you're not able to move out of engagement with them. So at least one model in your unit, in order for a pile in move to be legal, must end that movement within an inch of an enemy. However, that requirement's not true for every model in the unit. Only one of your models has to end that move engaging. I think it's also important to mention here that this is not necessarily the case for consolidation moves, which occur after you fight. So you pile in first, then make your attacks, then consolidate. Consolidation moves have all the same requirements, but if you are not able to get into engagement range with another enemy unit with at least one model in the consolidating unit, you're able to go to an objective that you can get within range of instead. Now, another comment actually on one of my short videos said, I don't think you can pile in unless you are in engagement range, since you need to charge or be in engagement range in order to be picked to fight. That is correct. However, if you charged, you don't need to be in engagement range in order to pile in. It's also important to note that obviously that is not on a per model basis, that is on a per unit basis. Piling in is the first step that occurs after you select a unit to fight. So you go to the fight phase and you go, I'm going to select a unit to fight, then they pile in 3 inches, then they attack, then they consolidate. You can only select units to fight that are currently in engagement range of an enemy or that charged that turn. But assuming that you have a unit in range to pile into, anytime you select a unit, they will automatically perform that pile in move or be given the opportunity to perform that pile in move, even if they had just charged but aren't currently engaging enemies. Obviously, with the requirement that we just talked about, that they must have another enemy unit that they can pile in and end in engagement range of. So while you do have to have charged or be currently in engagement range to be selected to fight and then pile in, it is not necessarily the case that you have to currently be in engagement range in order to pile in. Now, a couple of people were very confused about the physical operation of blocking your charge or your pile-in moves with your other models. One comment mentioned that the problem I see is that leaving a 1-inch gap between your models that are in base to base with a vehicle, we had a vehicle in the original video as the example. And intentionally leaving space between them means that you have plenty of space to add in more models. Now, another commenter actually swoops in to answer this concern here. And this is an important thing that I think a lot of people have gotten confused about. First of all, in the example we were giving, the models that we were moving were 32mm bases, which is larger than 1 inch, which means that a 1 inch gap between models will definitionally mean that you can't stack models in a rank and have them all be basing a flat plane. At the apexes of those circles, the distance between those is going to be too small for another base to get in. So if you can place those models in base and about 1 inch apart, that is going to prevent new models from getting in, assuming that they're all 32mm bases, which I think is the majority of the game. So a 1 inch gap is enough to allow models to be blocked. Now, the reason that that works is that every time you move a unit, doesn't matter the phase, doesn't matter when it's happening, that move is always conducted one model at a time. That's governed by the moving units rules towards the start of the core rules. So the requirements that when you move models for charging or for piling in and you get them to base contact, this doesn't require that when you start to move the unit, you determine the maximum number of models that could potentially pile in and then move to do that. That's not what it means. That's not what it even says. It says that each time a model in a unit that is charging moves, it must move based on contact. And because as the controlling player, you choose the order in which that move occurs, you can manipulate those positions during that movement. So you can go, hey, I'm going to move one model first. That will block the potential landing zone and base contact for the second model. Then that model can move somewhere else. I'm going to move another model to block the potential landing zone for the fourth model. That fourth model can move somewhere else. And you do that on a per model basis. Now, it's important that you do that precisely, each model at a time, but it is important to note that that is how all moves are conducted throughout all of 40K. Units aren't picked up like with a shovel, and then moved to a new position. Each model in that unit is individually shifted one at a time. And this got brought up in another comment, bringing up that if a charge is successful, each model makes a charge move and must move into base contact with an enemy unit if possible. First of all, this comment's quoting here, but it's quoting the rules summary bullet point, which is not itself rules. You have to go to the actual body of the rules. The rule summaries they're just there to remind you of how things generally work, but the actual way that those rules are resolved is described in the actual paragraphs of the rules. But so if you're in a situation like this where you're really looking for the meat of the meaning behind each of these rules, you have to actually go and read the full rule itself, not just the summary. That is what the summary says. However, that's not what the charging rules say. The charging rules say if the charge roll is sufficient to bring your models within engagement range of your targets without moving them into engagement range of new enemies and in unit coherency, the charge is successful and the models in the charging unit make a charge move. It instructs you to move each model a distance in inches up to the result of the charge. When doing so, each model in the charging unit must end its charge move closer to one of the units selected as the target of its charge. If you can also move a charging model so that it ends in base contact with one or more enemy models while still enabling the charging unit to end its move, satisfying all of the conditions above, you must do so. I think it's really important here to showcase that every step of this process describes you moving models individually. It does not say when you move a charging unit, you maximize the number of models in base contact, you move all models so that the largest number of them can be in base contact. It specifies the criteria for moving each individual model because you do those individually. That's what allows you to manipulate their position on the table in order to get more models out of base contact or out of a position where they could get base contact, which allows them to move more freely in their charge route moves. Now, obviously, this commenter very much didn't like this video, talked about how executing moves like this is cheating and all sorts of other stuff. They really didn't like this, which I think highlights an interesting philosophical question when talking about these moves. And I'd like to talk about some of the philosophy behind how these rules are interpreted and how these rules are implemented on the tabletop versus how some players might like the rules to work. One commenter stated, this was done and was considered cheating back in 4th edition, and described some of the ways that you could manipulate 4th edition's combat moves in order to prevent enemies from attacking you back. As a note, in 9th edition, this occasionally came up as well. One thing you could do is what we called a combat bounce, where you would place yourself engaging an enemy unit, but closer to a different enemy unit, which would mean that when you consolidated, you would go automatically towards that second enemy unit. That allowed you to direct your attacks to the first enemy unit, then bounce out of their engagement range and into melee with the second unit. That was largely enabled by the fact that there was no requirement to move into base contact if you had to. You just had to go closer to units in 9th edition. Again, the rules had a ton of minor changes between the two editions, but there were ways, even as recent as that edition, to do things like this. Mostly it was done to prevent enemies from heroically intervening, because you could engage them by the end of the charge phase and then bounce out of melee with them to the fight phase, so then you didn't have to be attacked by them. This commenter also goes on to state, this is why tournaments are not fun. This is banned in every tournament. I kind of love this comment because I don't think this person really watched the whole video. I literally include multiple clips of people doing this in tournament play at high levels. One of them was in the semifinals of a major that I streamed a couple weeks ago. So that's clearly not the case, and it's definitely not banned. And I'm fairly certain that it also wasn't banned or considered cheating in 4th edition. Maybe gamey and unsportsmanlike, sure, but I would be surprised if it was actually banned by tournaments. One thing that's, I think, really important to point out right now is that the current lead of the 40K balance team, Josh Roberts, is a tournament player, and not only a tournament player, but an incredibly skilled tournament player who is sort of currently redefining the metagame with his own play and his own lists. He is instrumental in balancing Warhammer 40K mathematically and mechanically, and there is a literal 0% chance that he is not aware of these interactions. It's not like Games Workshop doesn't know that this stuff is possible. They do, and either it's not worth the effort for them to try to plug these gaps, or they feel that it is a level of skill expression in the game that can elevate it a little bit more for more skilled players. Tournaments know that this happens. Games Workshop's tournament design knows that this happens and knows that these are the mechanics that they've written, and they are okay with it. Now, a couple other comments also talked about how it is clearly unintended that the rules allow this. I don't really like rules as intended arguments when it comes to rules. And while there are certainly mistakes made in rules where things are left in or left out and then corrected later, from a philosophical standpoint, the rules are the manifested intention of the rules designers. If they wanted a phase to be conducted in a specific way, the onus is on those designers to make the rules work that way. And we're now in 2025. At the stage that we're having this discussion, Warhammer 40K updates its rules fucking constantly. As I mentioned before, Games Workshop is 100% aware that the mechanics can be used this way. This is not a new and surprising thing to them. If it was something that they felt was a problem in a way that they didn't want the game to be played, they would change it in a rules commentary update. They've done that for tons of mechanics. They literally redefined how miniatures move on the table at one point. That's one of the most fundamental actions that you make in Warhammer 40,000, and they rewrote it from the ground up. Charging would not be a difficult thing for them to change, and they haven't done that. Obviously, I don't want to speak for them, but if their intention was for the rules to be played in a different way, I think they would have changed them by now. Now, another player left what is maybe my favorite comment on the entire video about how this move was bullshit and that there are no 0.1-inch markings on a tape measure. The fuck tape measure do you have, man? Mine goes down to 1/16 of an inch. Now, first of all, specifying that you cannot make movements to a 0.1-inch accuracy is so wrong. 0.1 inch is pretty small, but it is not that small. And it's certainly not the level of precision that you need to pull off in order to make moves like this. Now, you do have to be relatively precise in order to do this, but generally speaking, what you'll see players do is they'll showcase to their opponent that they do have the movement to go towards the targets that they want to and to base off where they want their opponent to go, and then describe their intention to their opponent. Say, hey, I'm going to move these models that can base your models here, so in order to prevent these other models from basing, and then they're going to move those models more freely.
So now I can't actually get any closer to you?
Correct.
So I'll go over here.
Oh, hello.
Okay.
It's actually really easy to resolve on the tabletop. It does not take an insane level of precision where you have to start getting calipers out. And even so, I think that precise movements like this that make use of the fact that Warhammer is a true measurement game and has literally infinite flexibility when it comes to positioning your models are cool and a benefit of the system. Sometimes the exact positioning of your models might make a big difference. Do I want to go around a wall, or do I want cover from more angles? A half-inch movement on that model might make a big difference in the terms of the game, and combat movements like this are another example of that. So not only only do I think that the precision to pull off these moves is achievable in a regular game, whether that's through using your 1/16 of an inch measurements on your tape measure or simply by describing your intention to your opponent, but I also think it's a huge bonus to playing a system that uses things like this. I love these discussions about the philosophy behind gaming rules and stuff like that. It's one of my favorite parts about making content for this channel. I hope this answered some questions that maybe you had about the fight phase and exactly about how these rules are interpreted and how these mechanics work on the tabletop. So let me know down in the comments if you think I ruined 40K and I released a 20-minute video about myself cheating. Comment that between 16 and 18 times and share it around to all your friends so they can also come and comment about how I'm a big cheater face and everything I do for Warhammer 40K sucks and I should be driven out of the community. If you want to support me, you can do so over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.